Welcome back to our podcast episode here, AI Meets Mittelhessen. Today we're in our second episode with Professor Dobbs from the JLU in Gießen. And today we're speaking about your field of research. We're having our cooperation still ongoing with the Forschungscampus Mittelhessen. And we're happy to have you here today. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So we're jumping right in with our little introduction of you and your career path. And I have the very first question for you. Maybe you could briefly introduce the Visual Cognition and Computational Neuroscience Lab and its main mission.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a long name, but we had a hard time because we had to squeeze in many topics. So we're interested. Our main goal is to understand vision, how humans perceive the visual world, and in with a particular focus on so-called high-level vision, so the recognition of objects, faces, scenes, how we navigate in the world, and how we do that with almost no effort, or it seems like that's sort of effortlessly. And then we're trying also to understand how is vision and perception organized in the human brain. How does it work? And to do that, we're combining methods from machine learning and AI. We're collecting human behavioral data, neural data, and yeah, use all these data, combining them to make sense of how vision world works, and to understand the computational principles underlying human perception.
Yeah, that's a very huge field and sounds very exciting, as you already said. And this podcast, we're also talking about the combination between the human brain and AI. Maybe just one quick question for the start, because the people are always saying, "Oh, AI is like the human brain or works like the human brain." What can you say about that?
Yeah, great question. AI doesn't work like the human brain in many aspects, but I think you can take some aspects that are brain-like. And that works particularly well for perception, where our field is, and vision also, where many neural networks, deep neural networks, are actually inspired by the visual processing hierarchy and how vision works in the brain. So basically, this layer-wise processing that you process from one stage to the next, and the information gets propagated. There are also filters that are feature detectors that are very similar to neural properties and characteristics we know from the human brain. So there's some coarse similarity in the principles, how they work. And that's the part that is exciting to us, where we can say, okay, well, if we now have systems, that are sort of inspired by the human brain, and they achieve human level recognition accuracy, at least in some tasks, let's study them and let's see if they can help us understand human vision better. So that's the part where I am. There's definitely, if you think of higher cognitive functions, decision making, interacting with the world, and so on, I think there's many parts where models are still lacking capabilities, or definitely don't integrate all those functions and so on, but we're getting there.
Very good. That was just the very first myth I wanted to bust in this
You're right.
podcast, because we're doing this introduction workshops in our project, and the people are always saying, "Oh, AI is like the human brain, and it's exactly like that, and it's so capable of everything." But as you already mentioned, there are so many things you still have to train the models, and they
Absolutely.
maybe are a little bit stronger in some fields, but we're getting there today in this podcast.
Mhm.
But getting back to you, you spent some time at the MIT and the Max Planck Institute before you came to Gießen.
Mhm.
And how did your journey lead you to this specific intersection of AI and neuroscience?
Yeah, I think I would even start a bit earlier when I
Mhm.
studied in Marburg, also in Hessen, not too far from here. I studied psychology and computer science, and the reason I did that initially was because I was always fascinated by the brain, but I also liked programming, and I was into technical things, and yeah, there were lots of things that fascinated me, and people said like, "Oh, you should study computer science if you want to find a job." Anyways, I thought like, okay, I cannot make a decision, so I just study both, and maybe after some time I'll figure out that I don't like one of them. And that didn't happen. But in fact, what happened is that I saw lots of interactions between these two fields. And I continued and finished both. And I think in hindsight, it was one of the best decisions I made. That also then helped me to get a PhD at the Max Planck Institute, because I sort of stood out from many other applicants with this interdisciplinary background, which was at that time really hard to get. Now you can study cognitive neuroscience and all these like shared programs, but at that time you had to decide computer science, psychology. It was much more constrained, basically. So yeah, I started the PhD at Max Planck, and Max Planck is already an institute where there's lots of interdisciplinarity. We had all the technical tools available. I could use sophisticated animation techniques to study perception from different aspects and so on. However, what I couldn't do at that point was using models to better understand the brain, because models were basically really bad. And then while I was doing the PhD, that's when the sort of new deep neural network era started. And deep neural networks, in particular convolutional neural networks, suddenly achieved human level performance in object recognition and many other visual tasks. And so people, in particular neuroscientists, became interested in using those models to study the brain. And then I thought, well, I have the background in both of these things. I would love to do that. And one of the labs who pioneered, in particular, the comparison between brains and models was at MIT. So there was a good choice for me to go and learn. So I went to Nancy Canbridge's lab, who pioneered functional specialization in the visual system. So really studying and trying to understand why there's certain specializations, areas in the brain that are specialized to focus particular aspects of vision. So yeah, I started in that lab, and then I had all these neuro AI labs around me, and that inspired me a lot. And yeah, it played a huge role, definitely, in continuing this intersection.
Yeah, it sounds like a huge way coming back to Gießen, but it's really interesting. There's so many interdisciplinary things coming into this model, into your research. And this is maybe next good question, because you are currently in the process of moving your lab from the Department of Psychology to the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. And how does this transition reflect the evolution of your research field? You already gave me some hints, but maybe you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
explain.
right. Yeah, so when I came back to Germany, I got this group leader position in the psychology department from the state of Hessen. So it was funded also by the government of Hessen, and that was restricted to 4 years with no further outlook for now, basically. That worked very well. I was very successful, I think, in these years. Then I got this European research grant and Heinz Meyer Leibniz Prize from the DFG for my research. Which I think then made other departments paying attention to me and my work. And so eventually the computer science department at JLU offered me a professorship for applied computer science with a focus on cognitive systems, which I gladly accepted. So that's how it went from psychology to computer science. But in a way, I think that also reflects much of my work, where I always felt I'm situated somewhere in between psychology and computer science. And with my research actually increasingly being more computational. And I think that's also not just my research, but that's a general reflection of the field. In
Mhm.
neuroscience and experimental psychology, all sorts of fields, we're using more and more computational tools, and analysis become more computational. So I think it's it's also a reflection of that. And I'm really excited. We're starting something new. We're starting this new Institute for Applied Computer Science. I'm part of the Center of Applied Computer Science and Data Science, where we really have this mission to bring computer science and AI into all sorts of departments and work on interdisciplinary projects, which is, I think, where I'm well placed.
Yeah, it's quite an impressive record, and already our first episode was also impressive. So many professors who are doing this research with all those data in the specific fields. And maybe we just jump right into your current projects and your focus on research. You have an ERC project called DeepFunk. It uses deep neural networks to understand the human brain. Maybe you can explain this reverse engineering approach.
Okay, with a bit of a restriction, I'm trying to understand the human visual cortex.
Oh,
I think that's important. The brain would be a bit too
yeah.
ambitious.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're focusing on the human visual cortex, and the
Mhm.
idea is basically that now we have these systems, as I mentioned at the beginning, these artificial neurosystems that are inspired by the human brain. They have some similarity to the human brain, but importantly, they eventually achieve human level performance in many tasks. So it's the first time that we have image computable models, so we can show them natural images, natural visual input as we humans see them, and probe them and see under which constraints, on what tasks do we have to train them to see certain phenomena in the models that we also see in brains, or particularly in the visual cortex. And that's basically the idea, is to find out or to use these manipulations that we can do in the models to find out what are the conditions, the constraints, the tasks that lead to certain phenomena that we know that we have in vision, or the visual cortex, and we know since a long time, but we don't really know why we have them.
Yeah, you already mentioned that AI outperform humans already in some tasks. In your specific field of the vision, of the human vision, are there still tasks where the humans outperform AI?
Definitely. Yeah. Many tasks. I think, yeah, that's why I'm always very careful if I say models achieve human level accuracy in object recognition, trying to be very precise. So definitely human vision is way more robust and flexible. So we can recognize faces under different viewing angles and lighting conditions, and even if they're really far away. And this is where systems very quickly still fail. They're also still very sensitive to their training regime. So if you take data that's out of their training regime, they usually don't work well. So this is, I think, where also the mission of the adaptive mind, so the recent excellence cluster that we received here in Hessen, is trying to understand how can the human brain and human perception be so flexible, so adaptive, and can we somehow better understand these principles, and then maybe also use them to improve artificial systems.
Yeah, that's always a really interesting question for me as well, because in our workshops we always trying to train a model with Google TensorFlow. Just really easy with the webcam and everything. And there was no team at all who were able to train a model which isn't breakable, because we putting like a pencil versus a book, and there's always so many different aspects in training this model. And this, I think, where you research coming into place, because yeah, you have all those different aspects how the humans view versus how the machines view.
Yeah.
And this would be my next question. One of your key questions is the why. And why does the brain have specific areas for faces or places? And how can an AI model help answer this fundamental biological question?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite questions, because it's somehow a very deep question, right? Like, we, since decades, we're studying the human brain. We're trying to understand the human brain, and we basically characterize all these phenomena that we observe, like, oh, look, there's an area that responds to faces, there's another area that responds to scenes, let's see what it does when we show it something else. And so we've described that, we characterized all of that, but we could never really get at the question for why is it organized that way? Why do we have functional specialization for faces, and why do we have it for some visual categories but not for others, for example? And of course, there have been many hypotheses, people saying like, well, you see faces all the time, of course you have functional specialization for faces, or this is all evolution, or lots of different ideas, but we basically never had a tool to probe these hypotheses. And that's basically because we're very limited in the manipulations we can do with the human brain. Now we have these artificial systems where we can manipulate certain aspects of the model and ask, okay, under which conditions do we see functional specialization? And our hypothesis here was that functional specialization for faces in particular is an outcome of task optimization. So of the idea that the brain is optimized to recognize faces. It's very important for us to recognize faces. We want to recognize faces accurately, right? That's for social life, for evolution, for all sorts of things. That's very important. And in order to do that, to recognize faces well, among other things, among objects, among scenes, and everything else that we see, we need to have specialized features that are sort of specialized to recognize faces. And that's why we said, like, okay, if that's the case, then we should also see that in models that we train to recognize faces and objects. If that's really an outcome of optimization, any system that we optimize for these tasks should show functional specialization for faces. Of course, we cannot test any system out there, but at least we found it in the systems that we tested, and that gives us a strong hint to that indeed it's sort of necessary in order to perform and to recognize faces well.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And when we spoke a lot about your models and how you want to do your research, but there's also one big challenge when it comes to AI, always the data. And that would be the next part of our podcast, to speak about your methods and your challenges also with the data, because you're combining human behavioral data, neural data, and those machine learning models, as you just mentioned. What is the biggest challenge in aligning these very different types of data sets?
Yeah, I mean, you already said it. They're very different types of data sets. They live in different spaces, right? Neural data is very noisy. It also has a timing component and so on. Then we have behavioral data, which is basically at the output decisional level of the system. So we cannot look in the system. We only see the output when we measure behavior. At least not that easy. And then we have deep neural networks, or any artificial system, which are high dimensional. We have millions of units, different things to study. So the big question is how to align those systems, right? And how to compare them. And one thing that we do is representational similarity analysis, for example, is like approaches that try to bring those spaces into alignment such that you can compare it. I think there's much work on it and also much progress that has been done, but it's still a challenge that is important. And in particular, trying to find out if you find a match between the model and the brain, is it a meaningful match, right? Does it actually mean that they work the same way, or does it just superficially look like they do? And then really going thoroughly into these comparisons, trying to make sure that you match the conditions exactly between what the human did and what the network had to do, and so on. I think that's the biggest challenge in this field.
Yeah.
But also exciting.
Yeah. There's so many different aspects in your specific research area. It's just really amazing how you try to combine all these different aspects. And when it comes to AI, but also to the brain, people are always speaking of black boxes, because we don't really know what's happening. We
Right.
don't really know how they're creating their output. But this is exactly your field of research, after all. Um, Maybe one question about that: is it difficult to use this one black box to explain another one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is yeah, it's a classic question, right? How can it help to use one black box to understand another black box? And my argument is always that yes and no, right? It
Mm,
is difficult, and yes, it is sort of a black box, but it's a black box where we have full access to, and we have access on a unit level, on a layer level. We have access to the experience of the model. I think there's many aspects that we control and can control and manipulate that we cannot, or it would be almost impossible to do in human neuroscience for sure, but even in general neuroscience. And that gives us a lever to better understand those systems, and to probe. So one technique that we use a lot is lesioning. So we actually ablate certain parts in these systems, and that can tell us something about whether that part of the system is causally involved in a
mm,
task. So if we ablate it, will the network still be able to perform the task or not? That's something like this causality, is something that we would love to know in the human brain. We're always looking at correlates. Something responds or lights up when you show something, but is that really a necessary part of the system, or is it just something that co-activates?
yeah.
We don't know. It's really hard to find out. And in the systems, we can do all that, or we can ask this functional specialization for faces arise in networks that have never seen a face. So we train a network and we make sure it's never ever seen a face. There's no human that has never ever seen a face, luckily. And but then we can ask all these questions, manipulate, and better understand what's going on. And then from that, and that's the important step, right? We don't just want to understand the systems. We then want to close the loop and go back to the brain. So I really see artificial neural networks as a tool to
Mm.
test our hypotheses. And then, of course, we have to go back to the humans, plan our experiments, collect neural data, behavioral data, and probe whether these hypotheses are correct or not.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also another field of research, is explainable AI. I'm looking forward to the next episode
Absolutely,
with Professor
absolutely,
Hannig.
absolutely.
And
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's
yeah,
its own
yeah,
field to just study that. The nice thing is that also here there's lots of inspiration from neuroscience, right? Because
mm,
we have in neuroscience and studying the brain, we've developed tools to understand the brain for decades. Lots of these tools are actually now being used to understand artificial systems as
yeah,
well. And so, yeah, there's this nice interaction between fields that's quite relevant. Yeah.
yeah. Um, Maybe one other question to your methodol. I hate this word. To your methods.
Mhm.
It's a little bit easier. How do you ensure that your AI models are actually biological plausible and not just taking this statistical shortcuts?
Yeah, that's a very critical and important point. And I think you have to probe generalization. That's very important. So if your network can do one task, then you have to test it on another data set, probe it on another architecture, another random initializations, and yeah, just be very thorough about all sorts of generalizations that you make. The nice thing is that with these networks, we can basically test them on millions of images if we want, on
Mm,
hundreds of experiments. So we're much less limited than we are in humans, where sometimes we see an effect and we're like, is this effect due to the 10 stimuli that we selected to show the human, or is it something that generalizes? In artificial neural networks, we can basically ask, well, if there's a phase selective unit, does it always respond to faces if we show it millions of images, right?
mm,
So we go beyond those limitations and in human neuroscience to probe it, but it's still a challenge. And again, a field, almost a field in
mm,
itself, trying to figure out, what are good ways to understand how the system is working, what kind of shortcuts it's doing. Sometimes two models on a performance level seem to be identical, but then if you look in the inner workings, they solve the problem completely differently. Yeah, I think all of that is important and requires that we test and test and test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
It's always the thing about
Mm-hmm.
those systems. Yeah, coming from your challenges to the ecosystem here in Mittelhessen,
Mm-hmm.
because we have a lot of universities, a lot of research, a lot of professions and people who are working here, also companies who are trying to integrate AI. Um, you are involved in this cluster, the adaptive mind, you
Yeah.
already mentioned that, and the Center for Mind Brain Behavior. How does the research ecosystem here in this region support your interdisciplinary work? We already said something about how you're interacting with
Different
different
departments, but I think
departments.
it
Yeah.
goes beyond institutes. Um, yeah, like this, I think this is exactly the place where my lab and our research should be. We in and at the intersection where we are, and in cognitive computation, neuroscience, and understanding perception, we need psychologists, we need computer scientists, we need clinicians, all sorts of skills and experts that come together here and not just on paper, but actually work together and collaborate. And I think the excellence cluster is just one example for or basically a showcase that works very productively and efficiently. Now, hopefully, maybe even the excellence university will see between Gießen and Marburg. But yes, since I'm here, I've been constantly involved in collaborative projects. We've been very successful in many fundings and grants. And I think whenever there's a skill needed, there's someone close by, even if it might sometimes be as far as Darmstadt. Yeah, this is something we truly benefit from. And I think that's very, very special about this region. And in particular, the focus on perception is, I would say, unique in Germany.
It brings me to the next questions from your colleagues because they already wanted to ask you something. We asked the other colleagues from you, the other professors, if they have some questions for you.
Mhm.
And I want to start with the question from Professor Hanig, who is speaking with us next episode. She's asking, from the perspective of your own research field, what do you expect to fundamentally change over the next 10 years in methods and theory or practical applications?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, big question. I think a lot. I think looking, yeah, maybe I was wondering, looking back 10 years, there's already quite some change in the field, but I think it will be even more. In cognitive neuroscience, I think we'll go at some point we'll go less from, like, initially our approach was we had an idea, we had an hypothesis, we would handpick some stimuli, think about an experiment, test it in humans, see if it works or not. I think that approach will change. What we will do is we'll basically use artificial systems as sort of digital twins and probe our hypotheses and our experiments and pick our stimuli based on those systems. And then eventually, if we think we have something interesting, we might go into human experiments. So that's what right now already I feel like I'm no longer just picking some stimuli and running an experiment and then figuring out that there was some confound and I couldn't use the data. I'm already now probing first, what does any artificial system say to these stimuli? Can they discriminate them? Can they decode them? Are they maximally divergent or not? I think basically, yeah, asking the artificial system first and then going into the brain might be a change that I can see. And definitely, I think that's what I tell all my students is they need computational skills. I think soon psychology, cognitive neuroscience without computational skills will be really, really hard. So yeah, that's definitely a transition that I see that will be hard to avoid in the future.
Yeah, there will be a lot of changes always with students and the whole process of learning
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got another question from Professor Sanford. We
Mhm.
spoke with her the episode before that. And she's asking, do you think that the recent hype and big hopes around generative AI is steering us into another AI winter?
Mm, I don't see that. I mean, there is the question a bit of, does that all lead us in the right direction or not? I mean, we're also wondering that a lot. We're putting a lot of effort in studying these systems for the brain, and then sometimes I'm worried if that's all the wrong direction and they actually don't tell us anything useful, or this sort of worry is definitely there. But then there's not just this one model, right? There's
Mm,
it's a world of models, and I think for every problem out there, there is a fit. And we're now approaching an area where models teach themselves and develop themselves and can change themselves. And there's definitely things to worry about. An AI winter is not my worry.
yeah. Yeah, that's really exciting because I think there will also be some app store for AI models like someday. I
Hmm.
mean, already
Hmm.
in those
Hmm.
generative AI, if you're looking at this large language models, there's always like one task for everything or one specific model you can
Yeah.
use for your specific problems. Yeah. Um, Getting to the end of our
Hmm.
podcast, and it's a little bit like Professor Hanek's question, a future outlook. Looking forward to like 2030, do you believe we will have a complete computational blueprint of human visual perception?
Hmm. No, at least I don't hope so.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I would be out of work,
yeah,
or I would have to change fields at least. I think there will definitely be huge improvements. We will have a much better understanding, better models that make more precise predictions of what will happen in the human visual system, and that we can use to probe hypotheses and so on. But I think it's really about understanding the computational principles and not about recreating the brain one by one. I think we've tried that, and that wasn't very successful and is no longer the goal. But definitely, I think this is, the big thing is really understanding now which computational principles matter, what can we learn from the brain, what can we learn from these artificial systems, and that together will help us better understanding the visual perceptual system, but hopefully also higher cognitive systems very soon.
yeah, really interesting. Maybe we'll see each other in 5 years and we can check into this question
Absolutely,
again.
that would be lovely.
And I
Yeah.
hope you will not be out of work because there will be so many things to talk about. So,
I guess so. Yeah.
yeah, and now we're already at the end of our
Hmm.
podcast. It was really valuable insights of your research. Thank you for talking with us. And we're really looking forward to the next and last episode of our little series here, where we will talk with Professor Hanek about the field of explainable AI. We already mentioned this today.
Exciting. Yeah.
And I think there will be also some valuable insights about how we can explain this black box we also mentioned today.
Hmm.
And we'll see you in the next episode. And we're looking forward to that. And thank you for having the time to speak with us today, um, with Professor Dobbs. And goodbye.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Bye bye.